拜登总统周三启程访欧，团结盟友因应俄罗斯侵略乌克兰。美国务卿表示，俄军在乌克兰犯下战争罪。美国之音专访前国安顾问博尔顿，俄乌战争后，印太是21世纪焦点。各位观众，大家好，我是卡拉，欢迎收看《美国观察》。拜登总统周三出发前往布鲁塞尔，他将分别参加北约、七国集团和欧盟领导人的会议，团结盟友一起因应俄罗斯对乌克兰的侵略。今天的节目中，我们一同关注。拜登总统出访欧洲，与盟友商讨应对乌克兰局势。美国国务卿布林肯周三宣布，基于目前已经掌握的信息，美国政府认定俄罗斯军队在乌克兰犯下战争罪。同时，亲乌俄军在乌克兰的地面攻势陷入停顿，但是对乌克兰城市的狂轰滥炸仍然在加剧。英国国防部在星期三的每日情报更新中指出，乌克兰整个北方战线，包括一路向基辅进军的大规模装甲车队，目前都陷入停顿。但是俄军强化了对多个乌克兰城市的围困和轰炸，造成严重的财产损失和平民伤亡，其中南部港口城市马里乌波尔最为严重。北约官员星期三说，估计已经有7000到15000俄军士兵在乌克兰战死，俄军总伤亡人数在3万到4万之间。联合国难民署数据显示，已经有超过350万人逃离了乌克兰，在波兰、罗马尼亚、摩尔多瓦和匈牙利寻求避难。乌克兰总统泽连斯基星期三表示，与俄罗斯的谈判正在进展中。他说，谈判非常困难，有时还颇具对抗性。联合国秘书长古特雷斯星期三表达了一线乐观的希望。他说，从与各方的接触来看，在几个关键问题上出现了部分外交进展。另外，波兰驱逐45名俄罗斯外交官，称他们为俄罗斯情报部门效力。俄罗斯说，这样的指称没有根据。乌克兰总统泽连斯基星期三对日本国会发布视频演说，重复了华盛顿发出的警告，即俄军有可能正在准备使用生化武器。泽连斯基说，俄罗斯正在准备像在叙利亚一样，使用诸如沙林毒气之类的化学武器发动攻击，但他并没有提供具体的证据。他还批评联合国在制止侵略上无能为力，呼吁对联合国进行改革，同时呼吁加强对俄罗斯的压力。俄罗斯是联合国安理会常任理事国，对安理会就俄罗斯入侵乌克兰进行谴责或采取反制行动有1票否决权。泽连斯基还赞扬日本是亚洲第一个对俄罗斯施压的国家，他请求日本继续实施制裁。拜登总统抵达布鲁塞尔，准备参加北约、七国集团与欧盟领导人的会议，他将团结盟友一起因应俄罗斯对乌克兰的侵略。星期三上午离开白宫之前，拜登告诉记者，他认为俄罗斯动用化学武器是一个真实的威胁。白宫国安顾问沙利文在空军1号上向媒体确认，星期四将会针对更多的俄罗斯政治人物与寡头实施新一轮的制裁，并说拜登总统正对中国采取积极的手段，也将与欧洲国家领导人共同商讨与中国相关的问题。下面请看美国之音驻欧洲记者里奇维尔的报道。
NATO member heads of state are preparing for an extraordinary summit here in Brussels Thursday following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg held a press conference here in Brussels Wednesday ahead of the summit. He said the alliance would do all it could to support Ukraine and said that 4 new battle groups would be sent to NATO's eastern flank, effectively doubling its presence there. He accused Russia of nuclear saber rattling and said that had to stop. And he also mentioned China, accusing Beijing of helping to spread Russian lies and disinformation about its invasion of Ukraine. Now, one of the most important moments will come with the family photograph ahead of the summit on Thursday. That's an image of unity that NATO wants to project about its members and about the level of condemnation of Russia's actions. What of the summit itself? What might be agreed? Kiev wants NATO to provide a no-fly zone across Ukraine and provide it with more military equipment like fighter jets. Now, those are things that NATO has so far stopped short of offering, fearing an escalation of the conflict and any direct contact between NATO and Russian forces. Individually, some NATO member states have been providing military support to Ukraine. The United States President Joe Biden, who is due in Brussels Wednesday evening, signed an $800 million security package for Ukraine, including armed drones and anti-aircraft missiles. Several other member states have also offered some level of military support. But the big question is whether NATO itself can give more military support to Ukraine. It's not just about NATO. Joe Biden will attend meetings with G7 leaders and with the European Union heads of state too. There they will discuss more sanctions on Russia and also the United States helping to break Europe's dependency on Russian oil and gas. Currently, Europe is sending Russia hundreds of millions of dollars every day for energy imports. It's not just Russia and the West watching what happens here in Brussels. Other world powers, like China, are watching carefully and seeing whether the West can offer a strong, unified response in the face of the threat from Russia.
前美国国家安全顾问博尔顿接受美国之音专访，他表示，美国需要进一步加强台湾问题上对中国的威慑，并且在外交上承认台湾，以防类似俄乌战争的形势在台海上演。博尔顿还谈到，虽然习近平获得第3个任期基本上没有悬念，但是他仍然面临许多来自中国国内的挑战。美国也应该加强打击中国政府和国有企业，特别是针对华为、中兴等用于进行政治和军事目的的公司，来应对中国在印太地区建立霸权的目标。
China is going to hold the 20th Party Congress later this year. Is there any doubt that you think Xi Jinping is going to get the third term?
I think this is part of the Chinese Communist leadership sizing up the Biden administration to try and determine how they would react if China put pressure on Taiwan, for example. Certainly in the first year of the Biden administration, despite some tough campaign rhetoric, there's been very little to deal with things China's been doing in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, domestically repressing the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, eliminating the one country, two systems regime in Hong Kong, whole series of things like that. So it's, I think, the assessment that Xi is trying to make is whether Biden would stand up if China exerted pressure in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure he's got that in mind as he faces the next party Congress. But unless I miss my guess, most of his enemies have been removed from senior positions in the Communist Party. I think there are many other challenges because I don't think China is nearly as stable domestically as some people would like the rest of the world to believe. I think the problems are growing. An aging population, economic instability, parts of the country that are still unhappy being ruled from Beijing. The Taiwan problem remains. And in any authoritarian regime, there are nonetheless struggles for control. So, but in the near term, I think Xi is very much in control, and I think that'll be reaffirmed.
Will China become a more dangerous opponent for the U.S. when Xi Jinping continues to be China's leader after 10 years in power? What's the grand strategy the U.S. should have to deal with China, especially with the war in Ukraine as a reference?
Well, I think China does have a grand strategy. I think you see many aspects of it, and it covers the full range of activity from economic matters to political to military. And I think its near-term objectives are clearly to establish hegemony in the Indo-Pacific, to become a global power, and ultimately to overtake the United States as the most powerful country in the world. So the immediate objectives for the United States are to try to deal with issues that have gone largely unnoticed for many years. The theft of intellectual property by the Chinese state-owned enterprises, that's been an enormous contribution to China's ability to undercut its competitors in international economics, the manipulation of the World Trade Organization, the unfair competition that China exerts through subsidies and preferential financing for Chinese state-owned enterprises, and a whole range of economic policies that are not consistent with the free market, and in particular using Chinese companies as agents of the state for political military purposes, like Huawei and ZTE, which are not simply telecommunications companies. They're intended to get control of international telecommunications, not simply for economic benefit, but for the benefit of intelligence gathering and influence operations. China has dramatically scaled up its military expenditures. Over the years, it's increasing its ballistic missile capability. It's got some of the best cyber warfare operations in the world. It really, across the whole spectrum of military power, China has been building up, and the United States and the West as a whole have not been paying attention. So these are all issues that I think the war in Ukraine now highlights, as people recognize that that although there's a war in Europe, which has woken up the Europeans, that it's all not sweetness and light around the world, the real focus for the rest of the 21st century will be in the Indo-Pacific. So to the extent that the U.S. can alert Europe to what Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, India, Australia, Southeast Asia already know, I think that will help get a more unified response to China. But that also goes back to reinforcing the Russian-Chinese entente, because as Russia is isolated from Europe now, isolated from the West, it doesn't have much of an option other than to turn to China.
Some people in Taiwan, they have raised concerns about Taiwan might be the next Ukraine under China's decades-long ambition. Do you see the imminent danger of China's invasion into Taiwan?
I don't see it as, I don't see China imminently invading Taiwan. In fact, I think in their preference in Beijing, they don't want to have to fight to get Taiwan. They don't want to inherit an island that's full of destruction. They don't want to see Taiwan's productive capabilities, chip manufacturing facilities or industry or the Kaohsiung port or really any of the enormous amount of economic productivity on Taiwan impaired. They want the island the way it is now. They just want it under Beijing's control. So the preferred way to accomplish that is not to invade, but to confront Taiwan with circumstances that make it impossible for the United States to aid Taiwan, to find an American leader who won't defend Taiwan, who won't respond to Chinese threats, and that leave the government in Taiwan with no option. Now, China has tried this before in the late 1990s. Even the Bill Clinton administration responded very strongly by sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups toward the Taiwan Strait, and China backed down. I don't think Xi Jinping wants to do this at great risk, because if he tried to confront Taiwan and the United States in a way that the United States did not back down, that could be threatening to Xi Jinping's regime. So he wants to act when he feels that he's not gambling, when the outcome is closer to a certainty. And I don't think that's where we are. I don't think the Biden administration is terribly strong, but I think Taiwan's support in Congress and among the American people is overwhelming. And I think that would be made very clear. So at this point, I think China is still trying to absorb the lessons that we're all learning about Ukraine, to see how the United States continues to react, and will then base future policy on that. At the same time, I think the United States should take more steps now to show Beijing that we have passed by the period of strategic ambiguity about Taiwan, that we do not interpret the phrase one China to mean what Beijing means, that one China in the Shanghai Communique was never conceded by the United States to mean Taiwan under Beijing's control. And in fact, many basic elements of the Shanghai Communique now no longer apply. And I've said for over 20 years now that the United States should grant full diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, exchange ambassadors and all the rest. And if China doesn't like that, well, that's just too bad, because we're recognizing reality, which is usually a pretty good place to rest your foreign policy. I think it's the right thing for the United States to do. The people of Taiwan have demonstrated they're fully capable of a democratic society with a wide, very robust political debate. They have a free economy, and they've been responsible in their conduct in world affairs. So I think as the United States works to bring South Korea, Japan, Australia, India into closer alignment to deal with the threat from the government in Beijing, that Taiwan is going to have to be a part of this. I mean, I think in Japan today, for example, people understand that a Chinese attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan. And new president is coming in South Korea. I think this is something that the U.S. needs to discuss with him as well. So it's very complicated. It's a dangerous world in the Indo-Pacific, but it's time now to try and work together with our friends to avoid this problem getting worse. The temptation is always to say, well, look, it's not so bad. We don't want to make it worse. We shouldn't do anything that anybody could take the wrong way. But I think Xi Jinping would read that as a sign of weakness. I think he can be deterred. I think Vladimir Putin could have been deterred from invading Ukraine. And our failure to do that may be read in Beijing as a sign of weakness. I don't think that's where the U.S. is. I think we're going to have a presidential election in 2024. It's a long way away. But where the American people are, I think, is that they still favor the peace through strength policies of Ronald Reagan, even if some of their leaders don't. So that, I think, is we're going to see the political debate in the U.S. on that subject over the next several years. Well, I hope people understand that the failure to deter Vladimir Putin is something that we need to examine to avoid it happening again in other places. It's true that we've put very severe sanctions on Russia, but that shouldn't make us satisfied that, well, it's true that Russia invaded Ukraine, but we're imposing sanctions. We're not happy with that situation. What we wanted, what we failed to do was stop the invasion to begin with. So I hope that one lesson America draws from this with respect to Taiwan is that the structures of deterrence that we have, while they're good as far as they go, need to be strengthened even more. That's one reason to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, to show that the United States understands it's not a lost dependency of China.
You were UN ambassador in Bush administration. What is your evaluation about the function or dysfunction of the UN? Another matter of fact is that China has been quite successful in expanding its influence in the UN and its various organizations. How meaningful is UN in today's world when Russia and China behaves less than responsibly?
Yeah. Well, the UN is a huge organization. That's part of its problem. It tries to do too many things. In the Ukraine crisis, the agencies that are right now performing important work are the humanitarian agencies like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, the World Food Program, the UNICEF, the last two being headed by Americans. That's the traditional role. And they provide, should provide humanitarian assistance on a non-political basis. And so their work is very important. What's broken at the UN are the political decision-making bodies. The Security Council is broken. The General Assembly is broken. The UN Human Rights Council is broken. And Ukraine demonstrates that very clearly. The 5 major powers, the permanent members of the Security Council, have vetoes that protect them, as in Ukraine's case, Russia, from bearing any responsibility for their conduct. And some would say, well, that's a basic problem with the UN itself. It was a basic problem during the Cold War, which is one reason the UN essentially collapsed. There was a brief period when the Soviet Union dissolved that people thought, well, maybe now it will perform as the framers imagined it would. That has obviously not happened. And so I don't really see any prospect in coming major issues dealing with China or Russia where the UN political bodies will have any significant role at all.
以上是美国之音对美国前国安顾问博尔顿专访的第2部分。欢迎您登录美国之音官网、脸书、YouTube 等社交媒体平台来了解采访的完整内容。欢迎继续收看《美国观察》。自从俄罗斯入侵乌克兰，俄罗斯已经成为西方跨国企业的公关禁区，数百家国际知名品牌相继退出俄罗斯市场。但是很多中国的跨国企业还保持着与俄罗斯的联系，有的甚至加码对莫斯科进行支持。与俄罗斯的密切联系会给中国的跨国企业带来什么影响？今天我们邀请美国之音记者许宁来介绍详情。许宁先给我们介绍一下西方的企业大规模退出俄罗斯市场是怎么样的一个情况？那中国的跨国企业和对这个俄罗斯问题的态度和西方的企业有什么不同？
是市场调研公司 YouGov 在本月发布的一项民调显示呢，有82%的美国人都认为知名的品牌应该停止在俄罗斯的业务，也有60%以上的英国人认为国际品牌应该在俄罗斯的对乌克兰开战的问题上表明立场。在本月初，麦当劳和星巴克都宣布将暂时关闭在俄罗斯的数百家门店，可口可乐和百事可乐也决定暂停在俄罗斯的业务。美国耶鲁大学整理的一份统计清单显示，已经宣布部分或者全部退出俄罗斯市场、暂停对俄罗斯投资的国际企业和协会组织的数量已经超过了450家，他们大多数是欧美和日韩的企业。美国和欧盟的多项经济制裁让很多公司因为不能将产品出口到俄罗斯，被迫退出了这个市场。但有许多分析也认为，俄罗斯成为商业上的禁区，对于许多西方公司来说，还有公关品牌形象方面的原因。我们来听听悉尼大学社会学副教授巴博斯怎么说。
We've never seen this kind of public relations reaction to conflict in the past. In the past, companies have closed offices due to danger to staff, but there's clearly no danger to staff in Russia. The risk is reputational. In the case of Western companies, I think it's mainly civil society pressure. Russia's a relatively small market, and there's a huge public reaction against Russia right now. And so many companies that have nothing to do with conflict, I mean, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Coke, Pepsi, have pulled out of the Russian market. They're responding to consumer pressure or their perceptions of good public relations.
而那些在国际上知名的中国企业，不同程度地保持对俄罗斯的支持，有的在中国国内的舆论压力下保持沉默，或者是扭转他们的立场。根据英国媒体报道，中国的通讯技术公司华为在俄罗斯入侵乌克兰之后，支持俄罗斯政府，帮助俄罗斯政府进行网络维护，对抗他们受到的网络入侵。另外，华为还同时计划在俄罗斯成立研究中心，为俄罗斯培养一批技术专家。一些中国公司还受到国内挺俄舆论的压力，比如网约车平台滴滴出行曾经在这场战争爆发之前宣布要退出俄罗斯市场，但是这一决定在中国国内遭遇中国公众的强烈反弹。2月26号，滴滴出行表示，在俄罗斯的业务不会关闭。 也有一些中国的科技企业则选择将部分业务撤出俄罗斯。总部设在香港的联想集团决定暂停向俄罗斯发货。中国字节跳动旗下的抖音的国际版 TikTok 3月6号宣布暂停俄罗斯用户上载新内容和直播服务。被中国吉利控股集团收购的沃尔沃汽车也在上个月的28号宣布暂停向俄罗斯市场发货，原因是担心美国和欧盟的制裁所带来的潜在风险。卡拉。
是许宁，其实刚才你报道中也提到了，这个西方国家，包括美国和英国的民众，绝大多数在这个俄罗斯侵略乌克兰的问题上是明显的站在乌克兰一边的。那么现在这些中国品牌在俄罗斯侵略乌克兰这个问题上，他们保持沉默，甚至是支持莫斯科，是否会影响到这些品牌的品牌形象呢？
是因为中国官方的立场是反对西方国家对俄罗斯的制裁，但长期保持对俄罗斯的紧密关系呢，可能让中国的跨国企业的国际形象受到影响。以华为公司为例呢，英国的下议院议员史密斯在3月3号在英国议会提出了质询，要求英国政府调查华为是否在帮助俄罗斯。华为英国公司的2名英国籍董事也在3月9号决定辞职。此外，波兰的足球运动员、德国拜仁慕尼黑的前锋莱万多夫斯基也与华为提前解约。有分析认为，比起在消费者中的声誉问题，国际制裁的威力让中国公司更加担忧支持俄罗斯可能引祸上身。例如，美国的外国直接产品规则措施这样的一个制裁措施，不仅适用于美国向俄罗斯出口的产品，也适用于那些在外国生产、使用了美国技术制造的商品和软件的出口产品。熟悉美
You've seen what's happened with Russia. The sanctions are incredible. And even companies that are not sanctioned are saying, I'm out because of reputational reasons or because, hey, you know what? It's not worth figuring out and risking getting in trouble to sell $100,000 worth of product to Russia. It's just easier and safer to get out. So they're out. Well, the same thing's going to start happening with China if China keeps supporting Russia. If you're dealing with China right now, you should be looking at what the world has done to Russia and figure that that could very well happen to China within the next few months. Now, it might not happen if China backs away from Russia, but if China doesn't back away from Russia, there are going to be a lot of sanctions and things are going to get really bad.
刚才听到的是美国的贸易行业的律师哈里斯在制裁方面的对美国之音的发出的这份评价。另外呢，俄罗斯的电子产品和芯片产品多数来自中国，在美国国内呢，目前就有许多呼声要求进一步制裁中国的半导体晶圆制造商中芯国际。美国商务部长雷蒙多曾经警告说，美国完全有能力让中芯国际关门，因为美国可以禁止该公司使用美国的设备和软件。本星期的一次美国商务部主办的跨党派视频会议上，特朗普时期的国家安全顾问麦克马斯特也再次呼吁制裁中芯国际。我们来听听他怎么说。
There's no reason why we shouldn't kill SMIC. I mean, SMIC, like Huawei, like ZTE, has enjoyed massive subsidies and has stolen our intellectual property and know-how. And I think that so export controls and I think are extremely important at this moment when we still have leverage in some of these areas.
分析普遍认为，西方国家对俄罗斯的制裁如果殃及到中国企业，这将是中国政府所不愿意看到的后果。美国《纽约时报》在3月15号的一篇报道中指出，虽然中国谴责国际社会对俄罗斯实施的制裁，但中国政府为了保护中国在西方的经济利益，中国公司也许会遵守这些制裁。卡拉，
好的，感谢许宁带来的详细报道。以上就是今天美国观察的全部内容，感谢您的收看，我们下次再见。